Hi everyone, my name is Rachel Taylor and I'm a PhD student from the Centre for Social Impact at Swinburne Uni here in Melbourne, Australia. And today I'm presenting some of the early findings from my PhD project, which is looking at the role of positive relationships and in particular energising relationships and its role in wellbeing in social enterprises. So for those of you who aren't familiar with social enterprise, the simplest way to explain them is that they're entities that trade for a social mission. So some of the ones that you may be familiar with, you may have maybe bought a Big Issue magazine from a homeless person in the street. That's a really common social enterprise here in Australia that works to provide homeless people with meaningful work and also increase their exposure out in the world. Sheltered workshops, you might have heard of. They're an example of a work integrated social enterprise. And some of the micro lending platforms, you might have heard of the Grameen Bank or perhaps Kiva, where you can invest small amounts of money to help small scale entrepreneurs in developing countries. So any organisation that exists for a social purpose, we can broadly classify as a social enterprise. And one of the key features of social enterprises is that they often are very resource poor, and they bridge this kind of spectrum between traditional profit-oriented organisations and the sort of non-profit sector, which is normally there to improve social conditions for people or the quality of life. And social enterprises essentially sit in both camps, so we see them as a bridge between these two different sectors. And so optimising human capital for these organisations is really important to sustaining the organisation, but very little is actually known about what the lived experience of working in social enterprise is, and in particular, if any of the wellbeing benefits that might be derived from social enterprise are attributable to the organisations themselves. So this is the sort of launching point for my project. And what I've looked at in particular is a concept called relational energy, which is a term that comes from the positive organisational scholarship field and also has a bit of grounding in sociology. And really what we're looking at is a phenomenon which enables people to energise each other in interactions, and those energising individuals have been demonstrated to increase the performance, wellbeing and innovation capacity of others that they work with. And as I mentioned, this also has sociological foundations, primarily from the work of sociologist Collins and his interaction ritual theory, which posits that humans are entities that seek to maximise their emotional energy. And my simplest way of explaining emotional energy, and particularly interactions involving emotional energy, is we've all, I'm sure, had those experiences of you interact with somebody and you walk away and you just feel like the life has been sucked out of you. So these are people that we call energy drainers, and the opposite of that is the energizers that we interact with. And what Collins' work has shown is that when we are involved in interactions that are energising, not only do we prefer them, so he calls this the basis of rational choice, which is that when we're energised, we seek to repeat those interactions. And so this is the foundational microsociology of how we develop a sense of belonging, how we build solidarity with others. And one of the payoffs is the sense of moral conviction, and in groups, a sense of shared identity and group membership. So my study is honing in on relational energy, but also looking at a couple of other relationships in social enterprises. And because of the size of the organisations, I was able to do a fairly intensive set of SNA work in these organisations in combination with some interviews and measuring some other factors, which I'll get into in a second. And so the actual context is a case study of 2 work-integrated social enterprises in Australia. And I deliberately chose ones that were mature and small to medium size, because that's typical for work-integrated social enterprises here in Australia to be around the 20 people mark. And I wanted mature organisations because I didn't want the high energy that's often associated with the startup period. I wanted the organisations to be sort of business as usual and stable, so that I could focus more in on the relational factors that were at play in these mature organisations. My first organisation had 18 participants and the second one had 12. So the data that I collected, so as I mentioned, involved quantitative and qualitative work. At a quantitative level, so I was able to do a round-robin survey that had a very high participation rate. So the first one I had 17 out of 18 participants responded to, and the second one I got 12 out of the 14. And I looked at 5 relationships, sorry. So I looked at energising, trust, problem solving, information seeking, and interaction frequency. So a range of affective and instrumental support relationships. In addition to that, I used a common measure of wellbeing, which is the flourishing scale. And then also to measure the level of psychological resourcefulness, I used what's called the psychological capital scale, which is an multi-component instrument that measures an individual's levels of hope, optimism, resilience, and self-efficacy. So that was the first phase, the quant phase, and then I went in and did interviews exploring what the quant level data revealed to me and why the findings might be what they are. So let's dig into them a little bit. So this gives you a little snapshot of the ratings for the psychological capital and flourishing instruments. The key thing to take out of this is that essentially what these workplaces are workplaces that indicate very high levels of flourishing and very high levels of psychological capital. So this chart on the right, the little donut, shows that 88% of the participants across the 2 organisations were at a high level of psychological capital, and about 80% of the participants were above the 50% mark, so above average on flourishing. So unusually high levels of flourishing and psychological capitals at play in these 2 organisations. From a relational perspective, what I've presented here is an aggregation of the ratings for the different relationships across the 5. I'll show you a sociogram in a second, but what I wanted to just show you here was just the high ratings, particularly around the energising and the trust. So what we can see here is ratings from, people indicated for each colleague, energising from a rate of 1, which was very de-energising, so this person was super draining, through to a rating of 5, which meant that they were highly energising. So the ratings of energising and highly energising across the whole data set was about 58%, so very high levels of energising, and as you can see here, even higher levels of trust. So 84% of the ratings were either highly trusted or trust. And as you can see here, we have basically no levels of highly distrust. I won't dig into too much just for time reasons into the others, but if you want to talk to me about the info seeking, problem solving or interaction frequency, I'm happy to answer questions about that. The grey bar on interaction frequency is a rating of about once a week. So people indicated that they were interacting with each other at least once a week in these organisations. So here's my sociogram for one of my organisations. The second one is similar findings for the rates of energising compared to de-energising. And so obviously what's emerged in this data set is very high levels of energising, very densely networked. The ties indicated in blue are reciprocal ties. The ties indicated in grey are unidirectional. And so this really led to a shift in direction for this project. So, because initially one of my hypotheses was going to be that people's energy status, so if they were an energizer, which meant that they had a high degree of energising, so people were indicating that they were an individual that was energising to them. that was going to be correlated to wellbeing, and also that proximity to an energizer might correlate with wellbeing. But this sort of threw that out because the density of these networks means that I couldn't do a lot of inter-individual comparison. And so I'm still digging into this data a little bit more, as well as the other relationship data that I've got. And one thing that has emerged from these findings is that the out degree of energising, so the number of people that you find energising, does have a moderate correlation with people's levels of well-being. So suggesting that the people that you work with, the degree to which you find them energising, may play a role in your well-being status. And what I'll finish with here is it's a fairly long quote from one of my research participants that is a response that she gave when I asked if she thought that there was anything in particular about the organisation being a social enterprise that might explain why the strong relationships that she'd indicated might exist. And the reason I'm presenting this quote is that it really illustrates the broad themes that emerge in my qual research, where people were talking to what it was about the social enterprise that they felt was contributing to their well-being, or just generally their description of how the organisation, the interactions within it were energising and what they called positive. So I'll just present this, and then I'll finish off with any questions you might have. So what's evident in this quote is the high degree of need satisfaction that's happening in this organisation, and the buffering against marginalisation. So a key feature of social enterprises, and in particular these work integrated social enterprises, is that they bring in and selectively hire people who've experienced some form of disadvantage. And so what emerged from the interviews was this very strong sense of that belonging, and a response to that sense of marginalisation which was being buffered against in these organisations. So I'll finish up there. Please note my email address. This is early work for me. I'm still finding my way in social network analysis. So I would love to hear anything more, any comments or feedback that you have, or if you have any questions. Thanks so much.